Howdy, howdy, howdy. It's me, Hunter. Oh, wearing my little fiddle. For me, it's been a while. In terms of me posting, you're like, Hunter, no one is watching this, and also you're posting like more than once a week. And to that I say yes. Yes, I is. But that's because I was reading a lot and just not posting. Anxiety. But right now, I think I'm doing okay. I think I got everything done for today. I think. I could be very wrong, but that's okay. I'm gonna set aside a little hour and a half to do my little reads. So we'll be reading Playground by Aron B. Now, the usual little triggers, which now, because I've figured out how to do descriptions, I'm gonna try to put, like, after I've read, like, be like, hey girl, it's actually decapitation, like, you know, get a little flippy-floppy. Fuck. I don't know what I was saying. I saw the flippy-floppy and I got confused. Okay. Trigger warnings. So there's already been lots of incest. I think we're done with that. I hope we're done with that. I don't think there should be any shit eating anymore. That was that. And then I feel like there could be another decapitation thrown in somewhere. Another very graphic description of someone's head being caved in and, like, the feeling of it being, like, bashed down. And then probably another child death, or death in general, definitely coming up, I think. So that, we got that to look forward to. I look like a child. I'm okay with that. But yeah, so now we're gonna be going back in. Last I left off, it was on page 155, and we had our first child death. Sam, one of the twins, which I did think she was gonna die early on. And honestly, it makes sense that, because she didn't have a whole lot that she was bringing to the table other than, like, she kind of was understanding. Donnie was like, you don't speak. Come on, you gotta come with us. But CJ already was starting to take on that role because as the main, like, leader child. So she didn't really have much to do. In that case, her purpose was just die. Whereas the other two girls, they have already been kind of, like, in my mind, queued up to be like, oh, potential, like, Geraldine, your mini-me, which you don't want, but if it means living or dying, maybe you do want it, just a little bit. And then CJ, leader, and then little Isaac, he's been injured, but he also has, like, this relationship with CJ / rivalry with CJ's brother, Doug. I'm making shit up. I don't remember anyone's name. But, yeah, and then Donnie, obviously, with Rock, has his relationship with Rock, and then Kip is, like, in the situation where he's, like, he is a very, like, impressionable, so he is, and he's also very athletic, so that'll come in handy of, like, I feel like it's gonna be a moment of, like, oh shit, he's doing everything right, but because he's so itty-bitty, tiny, little, I feel like if you separate him from his brother who's telling him what to do, he's gonna, like, immediately, like, I don't think mentally he will be able to, like, do any little puzzles to get out. I think he just needs to be told what to do. So we're gonna start page 156. The first of many. Zoom in on it. I want to see them. I want to see everything, Geraldine instructed. Fuchs tapped a few keys on the control panel in front of him and then twisted a black knob clockwise. The camera angle displayed on the massive primary monitor encased in the wall crept into gory details of Sam's face. The stomach-churning specifics within the massive pile of human puke blasting from the edge of the drop ceiling were pure nightmare fuel. The glistening hill of blood and bodily beef, the dead eyes, crushed jaw, and soggy crimson mane offered a disturbing final portrait. "Like this, milady?" Fox asked. Geraldine rubbed her hand together. She reset her gaze on the champagne bottle to her right and plucked it off the counter. "Any quick? My goodness." Aiming the cork through the open door behind her, careful not to damage any of the equipment, she popped it. Despite the majority of the decor in the house being Upper Eklund, the bubbling fizz spilling over onto the Turkish rug below didn't faze Geraldine in the slightest. It was a special day. She tilted the bottle sideways and dumped the contents into the glass. Once each reached capacity, Geraldine took one for herself and dispatched the second to her cackling cohort. Fox looked away from the monitor he'd just finished tweaking to show the agony on Sadie's face. She purged tears while still clinging to her sister's severed arm. It was as if she believed the cells might suddenly spring back to life. The girl's breakdown tickled him. He hadn't seen such hellish reaction since piloting his methods in the concentration camp. We'll add in some Holocaust warnings. He was, in fact, a Nazi. It was his job to extract such extraordinary emotion, but he was happy to do what he loved. Though Fox rarely displayed his pleasure, the destruction of mankind was his natural calling. But more important than his own gratification, Fox had simply calculated what he knew Geraldine yearned to see. He'd been around her perverse personality long enough to take hold of the reins. "Here," Geraldine said. She offered a glass to Fox, and they toasted. The old Nazi pried his attention away from the demented imagery. Grinning, he grabbed the glass and lifted it towards Geraldine's. "To our first," Fox replied. "To the first of many," she corrected. "Undoubtedly." They lifted their fizzing drinks with pinkies raised. After their glasses clanged together, Geraldine and Fox each ingested a celebratory gulp. "I feel so thankful. Part of me still believed, despite the increase in participation, that this would be a short venture, but not today. Not today," Geraldine trailed off. There was a slight tremor in Geraldine's voice. Her feelings had blindsided her. The unexpected surge of excitement left her on the verge of tears. She had done it. Her darkest dreams were coming true. Look at this sly older gentleman. I found the picture. Title card? No. Cover. I don't know what it's called. Yes, it is a shame that no child has made it past the second playground, but today, the odds are in our favor, Fox replied. The German took another swig of champagne, reveling in the bubbles as they popped upon his palate. But now it's time for the real special part. Fox tapped on the keys several times, triggering the gory video feed to transition back to the spy room. Geraldine was attracted by the bluish light from the screen connecting with the tear streaks on Tom and Molly's faces. Just like Sam, they were crushed. "If you cannot have them, then neither can they, my lady," Fox said. His bitter tone echoed in Geraldine's mind as he turned another knob on the control panel. The horrifying howls and soul-crushing moans from the parents bled through the dotted opening of the speaker. The anguish relayed on the evil audio would have shaken even the most heartless of humanity. Geraldine lifted the glass to her lips again. It was lovely to see others share in her pain. She'd been dealing with loss for some time. The loss of the simple bodily amenities the peasants procured naturally. The loss of climbing her mountain of desire. The infernal cries gave her a prickly numbness inside, a diabolical sensation she'd only hoped to obtain one day. The murderous structures established below the Borden estate were finally paying dividends, bestowing her with an involuntary camaraderie. Geraldine sipped her drink, taking comfort in the new truth staring back from the spy room. She was no longer alone. There are support groups, I'm assuming, for people who cannot conceive. people with depression. Granted, Geraldine is not. She's far past that. But there are support groups. Did we try that? Did we maybe try like The hangman. The children were disoriented from the overdose of shock, bordering on mania. Many of their beating hearts found rhythms of excess. The next steps were uncertain. Hesitation lingered. The idea that death might lurk around any corner was now undeniable. CJ looked on at the unglued group. It was all going to hell. The leadership role overwhelmed him. It was a position he regretted opting for. Sadie sat covered in blood, still snug up against her sister's severed limb. Isaac stood hunched over, throwing up a short distance from his sister's pulverized body. Reserve of vomit he'd held back could no longer wait. Kip cried, standing beside Bobby. Oh, it's Bobby, watching him hold his shredded forearms against his t-shirt to stunt further blood loss. Donnie remained by himself, seeming oblivious to the atrocities unfolding around him. The maddening sound of the baseball machines continued. CJ wondered where Tanya was. Dragging his mind away from the distractions, he turned back around toward the ball pit. Tanya stood in front of the pit, just a short distance from the tall but narrow steps. She was shaking uncontrollably, mumbling to herself as she gazed upon the hangman's chalkboard puzzle. Stab him in the head. Wiping the fresh tears, Tanya didn't let her focus budge. CJ detached himself from the uncontrolled motion of the majority was the best thing for the collective. He joined his sister at the ball pit. Stab him. Stab him in the head, she yelled. CJ looked up at the circular kickball sphere that was the hangman's head. His eyes then dropped to the shiny blade of the hunting knife fixed to its fluffy hand. You think that's it? He asked. What else could it be? Nothing else makes sense. Maybe that's why the knife's there. Tanya bit her lip. What if it's another trap? It could be, but I don't know what else to do. I don't think anyone's coming to find us here. Question dawned on Tanya that nonstop chaos hadn't allowed her a moment to consider. What do you think happened to Mom and Dad? Well, Mom's dead. Capital D. Minus the H. You know, it rhymes with dead, head. Subtract that H. It's just D. And Dad ain't doing much better. He is. Oof. Him? I'm waiting. I'm waiting for him. I'm waiting. I'm starting to feel a little bit bad for him because, you know, obviously no one fucking deserves to go through what he is going through, like, as, like, a parent. But also, would I be mad if I like, the opening of a Saw movie was just Greg? Absolutely the fuck not. He is the character you want to see die, and maybe you're like, oh shit, why do I want you to die? And, like, you question yourself morally, like, if you're new to this genre. I feel like this is something that, like, older horror fans don't have as much. I'm still kind of new, so I still every so often I'm like, I want you to die. Like in Hostel, oof, that was playing through my head of like, do I want you to get, like, brutally murdered? Yeah. Oh, ooh, you didn't deserve that. What do you think happened to Mom and Dad? I don't know. Sadie didn't feel comfortable spectating. You don't think they knew, do you? How badly do your parents have to be that you ask if you think they knew? How much do your parents prioritize money over you as a child? Tanya couldn't even believe she asked the question, but everything was so backwards that, as sick as it sounded, the notion seemed possible. Baby girl. What? Of course. My arms are still bleeding, Bobby moaned. Amid the commotion, CJ had forgotten to help his brother. Bobby appeared paler than ever before. CJ guessed the part of his transition had to do with stress, but the excessive blood loss wasn't without fault. From what he'd learned in school, the human body only had so much blood inside. If Bobby lost too much, it might spell his doom. CJ rotated his perspective back to the hangman dangling on the platform. While the dummy appeared to be made out of stuffing, the clothes fixed to his puffy body looked like a normal flannel shirt and jeans. I need your help, Bobby begged. Bobby, you're a little asshole, but you're a child. CJ approached his big brother and grabbed hold of him. He softly guided him to the ground before helping him to the seated position. I've got an idea that should help you get patched up. You just gotta hang tight for a minute, okay? CJ asked. Bobby was getting weaker. He nodded his pale face, hoping his brother would implement his idea sooner than later. CJ looked over at Kip. Come and hang with Bobby for a minute. What are you gonna do? Kip asked, trying to figure it out. CJ approached the narrow platform that acted as the staircase to reach the hangman. He took a deep breath and looked at Tanya. She was ensnared by the same debilitating dread that everyone else was, yet somehow she remained operational. So much time had passed them by. The more CJ considered their relationship, the more he felt he'd neglected it. He'd been far too focused on his hobbies and achieving his individual accomplishments. He suddenly saw the aspects of Tanya's persona he'd overlooked. The strength and heart she possessed bordered on supernatural. He'd never been so proud to be her brother. So I think next is going to be one of the the 4 children. It's going to be one of them. I could see it being, honestly, any one of the boys. Tanya's going to last until the end. That I'm confident. CJ, I'm a little confident in that, but also I could see him, because he's now having all these, realizations, and also we're really focusing on his perspective, that I could see him just any minute now. CJ felt his lip quiver as he spoke. I'll be right back, he said. Wait, what are you doing? Tanya cried. I'm gonna get the hangman down. We can use his clothes for Bobby's cuts. The puzzle says we have to anyhow. I don't want you to go. Tanya's voice was cracking. Just make sure the others don't go too far, CJ said. He made a quick arm gesture towards puke-drooling Isaac and the rest of the kids. Hold on. Maybe you shouldn't, Tanya cautioned. She didn't have to say it. CJ could see it in her eyes. He knew that she wasn't prepared to see him potentially take his last steps. He wasn't prepared to die either, but for a soul of his nobility, no matter how terrified he was, the sacrifice of absorbing the risk that lay ahead wasn't even a choice. CJ stepped toward his sister, not wanting to alert the others to what he was about to say. Bobby's bleeding a lot. He looks pale. I need to get those clothes, he said. I'll go, Tanya said. Her bravery astounded CJ, but the excitement of avoiding the dangerous task was a fleeting one. As athletically underrated as Tanya was, CJ had the best chance at getting the hangman down without issue. I'll be right back, said. This man does not have siblings. Not the sis. I get it. They're very detached from each other. They're not very close. Never in my life have I been like, yo, little bro. Broski. Never in my life. If I had a sister, I would never call her sis. Unless to bully people who didn't have siblings. As CJ turned away from Tanya, she looked at the long bleeding streaks running down his back. The ride down the sharp slide looked to have done a number on him, but upon closer inspection, the mass bloodshed made the damage look worse than it was. Be careful, Tanya said. CJ focused on the task in front of him and blocked out all the mayhem. As the crying, chatter, and loud shooting sounds of the pitching machines died out, suddenly he found himself alone in his head. I wouldn't want to be alone in my head at a time like this. CJ wondered what the fall into the ball pit might entail. What could have possibly lingered below that wasn't visible to the naked eye? Forget about that. You're not gonna fall. Did I miss something? What happened? He squinted at the slim, circular platforms in front of him and held his breath. CJ had always been relatively balanced whenever he needed to be, but this wasn't a time that he could just hope for the best. He needed to be perfect. Trying not to overthink the challenge, CJ exhaled and extended his legs to the first platform. The stand wasn't more than a foot or 2 from the ground, but its size was the tricky part. He wobbled side to side a few times before planting his other foot successfully next to the first. Feeling stable enough, CJ shifted his focus to the next platform. It was no higher than when he hurried up the stairs at home and went 2 steps at a time. However, there was far less room for error. Coming off the solid surface allowed him room to balance, but the tiny platform he was on made the next step even more difficult than the first. CJ's legs shook and his muscles grew tense as he lifted the limb up from the circle. He dropped his heel down on the next platform, regaining his poise. With his legs parted slightly, he tested his equilibrium. We've been talking about that in geography. Balance, I think. Threshold. think one of my roommates has someone over. Shifting his view away from the goal was a mistake. CJ's focus blurred the moment his concentration transitioned from the task at hand to the worst-case scenario. As he aimed his head at the hangman, his legs buckled. He was now faced with an all-or-nothing opportunity. CJ reacted by taking his best shot. He vaulted forward and attempted to bounce back and forth between each of the remaining steps to reach the hangman's platform. His first foot planted strong, causing relief to blossom in his chest. The generational athleticism he was blessed with could potentially be the deciding factor in CJ reaching the hangman. While his agility may have been superior to his peers, it didn't matter so much when his second foot came down too close to the edge of the platform. Panic pulsated through CJ's body as his sneakers slipped. He fell sideways with his shirtless, blood-drenched back closing in on the army of colorful balls below. As his body sailed downward, reality slowed. The fall felt much higher than it was. Flickers of CJ's brief life manifested before his starry eyes. The first images to occupy his sights was telling, a patchy compilation exclusively made up of the many moments CJ had lived for others. The long hours he'd spent in the grassy field under the sun, the hundreds of times the baseball found his glove, and the ping of the Middle Eastern bat launching the ball over the chain-link fencing. The countless curses and scowls that crimped his father's face. The box Greg had created for CJ was big, but still a box. Nonetheless, within was the long, grueling path his father had carved out for him, and no finish line. Next, CJ witnessed recollections of Tanya, Bobby, and Kip. While he didn't always get along with his brothers, a forgotten flood of good times rushed into his mind. There was an abundance of memories of doing things he enjoyed, but when they all came at once, there was enough for CJ to completely reconsider their sibling dynamic. The late-night ghost stories in the walk-in closet, the exciting games of tag and manhunt in the neighborhood, the countless trips to the video store, the cooperative games on Super Nintendo, the choreographed wrestling matches in the living room. I'm actually kind of getting a little emotional because, I'm thinking about my brother and how, if I was in this situation, would I be able to protect him? And the answer is probably no, because it's not designed for anyone to survive. If anyone, one person. And it would be hard to protect one person and ensure that they're the one that makes it, let alone if I had multiple siblings to take it, because how do you decide who and how to protect everyone? CJ considered that he might have spent too much time focusing on the things that perturbed him about his family. Looking back, they were much better than he'd given them credit for. CJ, Tanya cried. She instantly rushed towards the edge of the ball pit. He had expected a somewhat cushy connection initially, followed by whatever sick trick the evil witch had in store afterwards. But CJ surmised the balls that filled the pit weren't to be standard. While the skin of them looked like the same as any ball pit he'd ever seen, it wasn't. As his bloody back crashed into the heap, he realized their exteriors were far thinner, almost balloon-like. The weight of his body landing, full force, caused them to erupt. A white, grainy substance fluttered onward. Underneath the spheres lay the same hardwood flooring he'd just left, except inside the marbles there were more of the white substances from inside the balls. The substance became less mysterious when the agony arrived. It spread like flames on a dry wall all over CJ's back. Not only did the grainy pieces coat his backside, but the pop ball shot some of the sprinkles up into his mouth. The taste reminded him of the ocean. Ah! It burned, CJ. Oh, the salt crystals wormed deep in the wounds on his slimy back. The combination of blood and sweat hugged the stinging and acted as a bonding agent. In just seconds, the once snowy salt had become tainted by his fluids. As it sank further into the lengthy crevices, scorching burns stretched across the sympathy of slashes. CJ, are you okay? Tanya asked. He powered through the pain and crawled over to the platform. Forcing himself to his feet, CJ cried out in anguish. He tried desperately to use his arms to wipe off the crystals congealing to his back, but it was only pushing them deeper into his cuts. He just hoped that what he was experiencing was the worst of it. It hurts like hell, but I think it's just salt, he said. CJ's back was suddenly beet red. The flaring irritation on the surface wounds was the ultimate distraction, but his watery eyes darted around, calculating his next move. When they arrived on the backside of the hangman's platform, he noticed a small steel ladder had been affixed to the rear. It led all the way up to his destination. I think I found a way up, CJ said. Be careful, Tanya begged. CJ pulled himself up each rung of the ladder until he reached the hangman's platform. He took hold of the blade in the dummy's hand and lifted it above his head. Sawing the knife side to side, he severed ropes above the revulsions. When the hangman's lightweight body fell into his hands, he measured the toss. Everyone step back. I need to throw it down, CJ said. The small group of children now cluttered at the entrance quickly backed away, making space for the hangman. As CJ wound his arms backwards, he realized he finally was ready to throw a pitch that he'd actually cared about. And just like on the baseball diamond, his aim was true. The blade of the knife scraped across the floor while the body of the hangman landed in front of Tanya. With the salt still burning his back, CJ made his move. Descending the steps would be far easier than climbing them, but he still had no desire to go for another swim in the salt. He bounced side to side, landing each foot rapidly in a plunge towards perfection. But as CJ went tumbling to the floor near the hangman's limp body, he saw something unexpected. His eyes widened, and a gawk of deep disturbance clung to him. A faint sparkle remained in his pupil, but it wasn't a sparkle of hope. It was the light reflecting off the twinkling blade, whizzing towards his face. He's dead. I didn't trust how much time, like, I was like, oh, he's like a leader, so like, oh, he might be one of the children that are gonna be like no, he's gonna die. Like, he's gonna die. Gruesome grief. You fucking monster, how could you? You just let her die. You fucking let her die, Molly cried. Her glossy eyes stared a hole through Rock. Rock stood stoic, staring forward at the giant monitor. He tried to ignore Molly's harsh words, but they weren't completely lost in him. And the room wasn't so dark. The other grieving parents would have seen the subtle crack forming in his expression, the growing gash of guilt on his lips, an understanding of the evils that had attached to him like a leech inside a lake. My baby's gone. My baby's gone, Molly continued. Tom sobbed uncontrollably as he reached for her hand, but he couldn't find the words to distract her. There was no way for him to compartmentalize his feelings any longer. Grief that no parent should have to digest expanded inside. A sequence of hysterical sobs rattled off his lips. Rock tried his best to disregard Molly's word and Tom's devastation. What they were saying made too much sense. The guilt in his gut was as salty as the wounds he'd seen on CJ's back. Rock, honey, no, we're not allowed to compare our emotional feelings, that though we are not completely responsible and we are also a victim, we are not going to compare to the child who you have helped hurt. That is not what we're going to do. That is not what we're going to do. It was a first. No one had ever loomed over his shoulder to offer such an agonizing commentary. In the past instances, while piloting the playground, Rock was completely detached from the parental side of the trauma. He had simply watched each lone child find their way to an untimely demise. The deaths were swift, and the tension was low. Dudley tasked him with cleaning up the remnants of violence, but the leftover limbs and ravaged carcasses had little to say. There was never a protest or philosophical insight to offer. Those elements had long left the children by the time he'd become responsible for them. Rock likened the current situation to what it might have been like to have been forced to visit the homes of the little boys and girls he disposed of. She didn't even have a chance, Molly yelled. Rock retracted into his damaged mind like a turtle tucking into its shell to protect itself. Suddenly the familial cries and groaning were no longer harassing him. Rock focused on his half on an internalized argument. Maybe it ain't the worst thing. Not having a chance might be the best thing she ever got. I got a fucking chance, Rock thought. Okay. To be fair, in this situation, knowing what's going to happen to the survivor, there isn't a good outcome to wish for. Any death that befalls upon these children is not going to be quick. It is not going to be painless. They will hurt. They are hurting. But surviving isn't going to be winning. If that makes sense. There is no winning. Greg remained horrified, but the water in his eyes had dried over his stressed cheeks. The surreal feeling of his loss continued to weigh heavy on his mind, but now that he'd seen one child die before his eyes, it felt like someone had slapped him across the face. While the Grimleys fractured into shambles, he felt himself awaken. He squinted at the big bastard watching over them in the darkness, then back to the TV screen. Greg had already lost his wife, but his children had survived. He was grateful for that much, especially for his prospects, CJ, and to a lesser extent, Kip. The uber-competitiveness, shameless piece of shit that stood on the sidelines, living vicariously through his own children, he had returned. Greg's warm, thudding heart slowed to an icy, calculated intensity cascaded over it. His eyes slid back to the big screen ahead. Close-ups of the Grimley's kid looked like a can of crushed tomatoes. Didn't make him feel good, but it made him feel grateful. Better theirs than mine, Greg thought. In my mind, I hear him saying that as a better theirs than mine, but I understand that it is a point of like, I'm glad that's not my child. I have a chance to still see my children. Because I don't know how much he understood of the situation, because he was still in shock after his wife murdering, which despite how unhealthy the relationship was, I think they did have genuine like love for each other. I just don't think they had respect for each other. They love each other. Flaming pain. Can you tell like I'm trying to make this a little uppity, but like my psychological little analytical brain is like woo 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 woo. The steel flashed by CJ's face and plunged directly into the hangman's. His fall occurred so quickly that he was able to register anything prior to the crash landing. He hadn't seen the hangman lying by his side, nor had he seen Sadie take hold of the knife, or the look of darkness bubbling in her eyes when she stared at the fictitious man's head. CJ had zero forewarning of the hate she directed towards the hangman. In Sadie's mind, the inanimate figure was responsible for her sister's death, and as she slammed the knife into the weathered kickball and watched the blade slice through the rubber, she could no longer control her fury. You killed her, Sadie bellowed out. After stabbing the hangman several times, she shifted her vengeful thrust to the fluffy body. Poke after poke saw small streams of cotton from the dummy's interior sent streaming outward. Isaac, we need the clothing still. Isaac took CJ's hand and stepped up behind his sister. Sadie, calm down, Isaac said. Sadie didn't hear his words. She remained lost in her inner torment, slashing away at the hangman. As the knife cocked back for the next stab, Isaac grabbed her wrist. He even surprised himself by the way he took charge of the volatile situation. CJ had given him the shirt off his brother's back to patch his arm up. The least he could do was try to reciprocate. It wasn't until Isaac got Sadie restrained and pulled the knife from her clutches that Tanya started screaming. She kicked her legs wildly side to side. Ants! There's ants everywhere, she cried. Tanya stepped away from the hangman's hellish head. She observed a mass of flame-colored fire ants as they scrambled about feverishly with rage and hunger. The army of tiny hellions climbed up the feet and calves of the children, pinching onto flesh with malicious intent. The bites were true to the sadistic insect's name. A sharp, stinging pain blazed around Tanya's ankles. The intense burning sensation spread as she continued to yell and kick. What the? CJ yelled. He gawked out at the horde of agitated ants. Waves of the insect continued to pour from their previous area of confinement. All of a sudden, the stitches on the face and the hangman made more sense. The ants had been intentionally implanted inside his head. As the rest of the kids backed away from the countless fire ants, CJ spied a plastic baggie sitting inside the deflated dodgeball. Through a transparent bag, a key, and a piece of paper could be seen. He knew the contents had to be critical. CJ sacrificed a moment to bend over to retrieve the plastic bag and removed the collared shirt from the dummy. The minions pounced on him, scurrying off the shirt and up into his shoes. He flung his legs and used his arms to snake as many bugs off as possible. Thinking quickly, CJ kicked the kingman's head into the ball pit. Clusters of the pests still contained in the rubber landed in the salty floor. There were still plenty of fire ants rallying around them, but CJ had bought a little time. They're gonna climb out of the ball pit soon. Would they not die? Or is that just snails? I assume it would kind of apply to other insects as well. And if nothing else, your blood that pooled around in the salty wounds, it's gonna ants don't like water. Did you bleed enough? Maybe. Did you? Maybe. He continued to shake off the bugs. Once he displaced enough of the angry creatures from his body and the items, he tossed the long-sleeve flannel at Bobby. Hold on to that. Tanya, we need to look at this first. Fast. Oh my god, I don't like the idea of things crawling on me. I'm okay if they bite me, just don't... Ugh. Just, stab me a little bit. Don't have things on me. Tanya was still knocking off ants from her body, but tiptoed around the larger masses and arrived beside CJ. She looked at the plastic baggie he just ripped open and grabbed the small note beside the skeleton key inside. What's it say? I'm opening as fast as I can, Tanya replied. Her shaking hands pulled the parchment apart. She did her best to focus on the scribbled words amid a stampede of insects. CJ stomped out the fire ants as they continued to trickle towards them, trying to allow Tanya to focus. You must follow directions, or all shall bleed. Remember, the playground chooses when you actually leave. If your reaction was swift like the crack of a whip, Then you notice the lever to the left of the pit. Pull down, and in the ceiling you'll see the hole inside the pink is awaiting a key, Tanya said. CJ's eyes moved to locate the red lever sitting in plain sight. When Sam freaked out, they didn't exactly get any time to think out their next steps, but the poem had spelled it all out for them. Had they been able to solve the puzzle first, the path to certain death that Sam went down wouldn't have been completely avoided. She's a child. She's not going to think rationally. Also, very few people are going to think rationally in this situation. Upon Tanya reading concluded, CJ didn't even need to say. Each of the kids were already listening closely. They all watched on, ready to follow him. As CJ approached the sloppy pile of horror that Sam had become, he was able to overlook the nauseating sight in his haste. He gazed upon the glowing pink exit sign that once sat above the hallway. It was now so close to the ground that he had to squat to align with it. In the center of the hot pink sign, just like the riddle said, a small hole appeared ready to accommodate the skeleton key. Had he not known it was there, it would have simply blended in with the rest of the wall. CJ cranked his head back towards his sister. "Give me the key," he said. CJ inserted the key and twisted. The ants continued to flow up around the ball pit. The red-spotted trail of torment was rapidly closing in on them. He felt relief as the wall above the signage collapsed in on itself. The newly fashioned opening was made of cold metal, and the dimensions of square tubing ahead were about twice the size of a standard air duct. While the fear of the unknown still loomed over them, the agonizing jaws of the tiny terrors outweighed it. CJ, Tanya, and Isaac all helped the smallest children inside first, followed by Bobby. As CJ crouched inside the aluminum with the rest of the group, his hands shook. He couldn't avoid pondering what the next set of horrors they'd be up against might be. The possibilities were beyond chilling. Molly and Tom sobbed steadily, but each worked internally to control their shock and hysteria. The atrocious feelings of ghastly imagery lingered. They wouldn't be easy to overcome. But as Tom watched Isaac and Sadie each climb into the duct, he pushed his sight to shift. He knew he had to concentrate on the children that were still alive for any of them to have a chance. While the notion felt like it would require a miracle, Tom knew nothing was impossible. The more he dulled his emotions, calmed his body, and rationally analyzed the situation, the more room for opportunity he saw. The gateway to their children and their horror suddenly went black. The TV monitor displayed nothing. A confused expression overcame Rock's face. He furrowed his brow up toward the camera in the corner of the room, then back to the TV monitor. Since the screens the parents watched were embedded in the wall, Rock knew the camera angles wouldn't provide the control room a look at the malfunction. Rock looked at the three captives, their squarish face brandishing a curled grimace. "Don't do anything stupid. I'll be right back," he said. When Monk exited the dimly lit room, Tom and Molly immediately looked at each other. We've got to get out of here. What are we going to do?" "He's the key," Tom replied. "What do you mean?" "I mean we have no options. He's our only shot. We sure as shit aren't going to get out of these chairs unless he lets us. I know you see it too. His eyes are showing his hand. He knows this is fucked. He's not like them." "Then why the fuck are we still here, genius?" Greg exclaimed. "Look at your goddamn voice. I'm not saying he's ready to crack right now. He needs some convincing. We all saw the way that old witch controls him. He's under her thumb. We've got to work together and help him realize what she's done. Not to us, but to him." "What? For all we know, this could have all been his doing," Greg refuted. "Now who's fucking speculating? Oh, fuck you, tough guy. That piece of shit walked in here covered in blood. You think that's some kind of accident?" "I don't know, but it's not like we have a better option," Tom reasoned. "What do you mean? He told her right in front of you that he killed someone for trying to get away. And now you think he's gonna let us walk? Listen to me. I don't give a shit what he's done. Forget about that. I'm telling you, sure as the Super Bowl's on Sunday, he's the only chance we've got." The football reference seemed to be the dog whistle that made Greg's ears perk up. He found himself actually listening to Tom. "I'm begging you, Greg. Just give it a chance. Work with us so we can all get the fuck out of here, please." Greg turned to his blood-drenched wife with confusion. It was almost as if he was looking for guidance from her. Had Lacey's body throbbed with a pulse, her husband's response might have been different. But now alone in the world, Greg could only be himself. "No. No one's getting out of here. You're just afraid. You know your kids don't got what it takes. I know you see it. My boys are out here doing all that heavy lifting. They'll make it in the end. And when they let me see him again, when they let me out of this fucking chair, it's gonna be hell to pay." I suppose a part of your psyche could be damaged in this moment and think, yes, this is a potential outcome. There is a chance he genuinely, like a regular person, would go ahead in this situation and believe that. There's a chance, but surely he knows that at least one of his children, I don't think he cares about his other children. I think he just wants He just wants CJ, and if not CJ, then Kip. If not Kip, Tanya. If not Tanya, fucking Bobby. That's how Greg glared over at the gaping wound in Lacey's pale neck. The blood in her body had finally run dry. While the twinkle of madness in Greg's eyes had only grown, inside he knew it was utmost certainty. She would have been proud of their children. Yeah, I think having pride in your children, being able to be resourceful, for the most part keeping rationale and, protecting others, I would also be very proud. Who gives a shit if they make it or not? Even if they get to the end, you think they're just gonna let us go after that? People are dead. What about that doesn't register in that thick fucking skull of yours? Tom lost his cool. Greg knew exactly how to get to him. A pussy like you wouldn't get it, Greg laughed. Get what? Well, I'd like to think I'd tear some ass if they let me out of this chair. In the grand scheme of things, it probably doesn't even matter. Why do you say that? Because in all likelihood, we're already fucking dead. The future is fried. All that's left in this competition now is the blood against your blood. In one last duel for old time's sake, and guess what? Tom didn't humor him with a response. But that didn't stop Greg. After a moment passed, he carried on. The Matthews clan ain't going out like losers. Greg centered his hand over his lifelong cheerleader. He cradled his love's dead palm with a boundless certainty. Ain't that right, baby doll? He whispered. A fresh teardrop hissed out of his eye duct. For such a competitive asshole, you sure give up easy, Molly said. She didn't know if the comment might help to bring him closer into the fold, but Greg's response proved that her attempt to reverse psychology had fallen flat. A manic grin formed on Greg's face. Oh, I haven't given up. Not by a long shot. Just you watch. Let the games begin. Disobedience. When Rock entered the room, the remnants of celebration stung him. He wasn't confronted by just a single champagne bottle. Geraldine and Fox were on their third, and their glasses had been refilled. He figured it must have been sweet to take a few moments and drink nice booze, to pause and recognize their many years of hard work coming to a head. Things had gone off almost without a hitch. Rock's poisoned mind instructed his heart to ache. He just yearned to be part of something, even if it was something evil. Oh, buddy. But after years of obedience, there was still no thanks. Decades of hard labor and following Fox's complex instructions meant nothing. Kidnapping men and using their slave labor to help erect their... Okay. Didn't deserve praise. No matter how hard he worked maintaining the grounds, a peep was never said. Regardless of how many destroyed corpses or used up men and test children he disposed of, Rock would always be taken for granted. The presence of the German and Geraldine caused him to cringe. He ground his teeth and clenched his fist at the sight of them. Rock's ears grew red hot, and the discomfort under his skin bubbled. The rotten memories of insignificance, unflinching abuse were gnawing at Rock's limbic system. They didn't understand him. They'd never understand him. He'd always be shit to them. The joyous chatter between Geraldine and Fox died down. It was as if the lady of the Bourne estate could sense a presence in the room. As she sluggishly craned her neck backwards, her suspicions were validated. Geraldine's cold, drunken gaze cooled Rock's steaming fury. He'd seen those bloodshot, perverted eyes too many times to count. Flashes of unpleasantness bled into his brain. The many repulsive chores she demanded of him molested his mind. Rock's hammy fist slowly unballed, and his jaw slackened at his attempt to speak. The monitor in the, "What the fuck are you doing here? How many times have I told you not to leave them alone? There was one rule for you to follow, one rule, and I should have known it was too much," she screamed. With her tantrum in full swing, the filled glass of champagne Geraldine just lifted to the ground went flying towards Rock's face. When it slammed against his jaw of steel, the glass burst into fragments. The sharp remnants sinking into his flesh shouldn't have stunned him, but it did. The cuts weren't deep, but the trauma was, and the shards were mighty enough to draw blood. Several slices of various dimensions resulted in drizzly expulsion of the blood from Rock's overly defined cheekbone. He lifted his big mitt and wiped the blood and bubbly off his face. Rock had grown physically immune to the abuse, but emotionally it was another story. He didn't know what to do next, so he did nothing. An uncomfortable silence surfaced as Geraldine and Fox gawked at him. The look of irritation shriveled Geraldine's expression was wince-inducing. "Well, why are you here?" she barked. The monitors in the spy room went black. You may want to fix it if you want to see what happens, Rock replied. The big man watched as Fox turned back around and quickly sipped his champagne. But just as the Nazi bastard had always done, Fox had no issues watching the violence unfold without protest. That's because we're shifting to the second playground, you buffoon. If you just listened to me the first time, you'd understand. I told you we would come to you if we saw a lack of reaction to the parents. If you could just learn to listen, then your face wouldn't have to look the way it does. Rox raised his hand up to his cheek and wiped away this new blood. Some of the tiny glass particles remained in his skin. As his calloused fingers pushed them downward, they scratched his cheek again. Save for the branding of his chest, most of his other scars had been subtle. Similar to Donnie, they seemed to manifest in places that most strangers weren't privy to. He took pride in not selling the attack. He didn't want Geraldine to get the satisfaction of hurting him. The outbursts occurred frequently enough that he'd conditioned himself. He was like one giant ball of pins and needles, tough as nails and numb as Novocaine? The dentist drug, I think. Yeah, Novocaine, they have a song. When the darkest feelings came to Rock, Geraldine knew how to counteract them, but this time felt different from the others. For the first time, she saw the inner rage lingering on his face. Such berating usually erased all emotion in the massive man. The emotional positioning Rock presented puzzled Geraldine. The detestation Rock typically subdued caressed his brain. He enjoyed thinking about Geraldine and Fox. He was enjoying it so much that the blood creeping down his face had stained much of the yellow enamel that formed his unhinged grin. What the fuck are you smiling about? What do you have to smile about? Another failure, Geraldine yelled. She picked up the champagne bottle at her side and took a swig directly from it. Just happy is all, Rock lied. Well, go fucking be happy in the spy room, you feeble-minded waste. Rock tipped his flat cap at the old hag, not allowing his wide grin to waver. The irony taste of blood that entered his mouth would act as his champagne. For now. In the back of his mind, Rock wondered if he might ever have the celebration of his own someday. The possibility didn't seem out of the question, but first, he would have to find something worth celebrating. I'm worried. I'm a bit worried. Ooh, hopscotch. That's the name. Ooh, hopscotch. Hopscotch. Happity, hopscotch. As the children departed the metal duct, they landed on a rock platform. The heavy stone material was about the size of a tight bedroom, but unlike any of their bedrooms, the edges of the platform dropped off into a pit of darkness. The uncertain borders were frightful. Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. I've 17 more pages and I get to call my mom. A ruthless mechanical hum reverberated in the ear canals. It was the first hint that what lay ahead might not be pleasant. It was the first hint that up ahead might not be pleasant. I got a list of things that might tell you it's not pleasant. Secondly, a flurry of shrill, bellowing cries could be heard, integrated within the machine-driven noise. But the visuals were more jarring than the veiled clues. At the end of the circular rock platform, the stone narrowed into a slim path. A straight stretch of hopscotch lay ahead. The chalk outline displayed a single column that consisted of 8 steps. The setup was a traditional one that all the children had seen at one time or another. The first 3 steps consisted of numbered squares, 1, 2, and 3. Afterwards came a pair of squares set aside by numbered 4 and 5, then a single square with a 6, another set of double squares labeled 7 and 8, and a single square with a 9. Lastly, concluding the gauntlet of horror, was a final space labeled Heaven. I don't trust it. I feel like it's going to be like a whoever's last, or if you don't all complete it in this time, you die kind of thing, you know? Excluding the chalk, the Heaven platform was the same as the one they were standing on. Besides the word, there was also various disturbing depictions that were drawn with an inordinate amount of detail. The imagery took up nearly the entire space. The colors that comprised the artwork were simple, white and red, but the color scheme was chosen with intent. The chalky sketches were gruesome in nature. They portrayed several angels being ripped apart. One had been stabbed and was covered in gaping wounds, while another hung lifelessly from a noose. There was even a third angel that was being strangled with its own halo by a pair of devilish hands. Beyond the blasphemous artwork stood a cracked open door. Nothing could be seen except the ominous crimson glow that bled out from the other side. Above the framework, painted in a drippy red font, read the word Hell. While all those details were beyond alarming, there was nothing that could compare to what had been erected on each side of the hopscotch path. As CJ inched closer to the edge, the powerful machine, like churning noise, grew in intensity. On each side of the childish game were two enormous rectangular meat grinders, spun their sharp steel innards without fail. The spiky metal doom he gazed upon churned mercilessly. When faced with the man-made beast, the thoughts of hope and progress sailing through CJ's skull were overshadowed. The shrieks and cries that ripped towards them from above could also not be ignored. The foursome of full-grown cows had been divided equally, 2 of each on the hopscotch trail. They stood uneasily in their bared cell, hooves clattering on the solid metal floors. What the? CJ's speech was interrupted by the slashes that straddled his backside. The salt hadn't let him forget how much had been slathered across his wounds. But CJ wouldn't allow himself to wallow in anguish, and quickly recalled his brothers. "Isaac, can I have the knife?" He stretched out the collared shirt. "Sure," Isaac replied. The boy could barely tear his gaze away from the dreadful machinery. "I've got you, Bobby," CJ said. CJ approached Bobby with a knife and snatched the hangman's shirt. He cut the fabric into lengthy strips until he had multiple pieces ready. He slid the blade beneath his waistband and readied the flannel sections. "This might hurt a little," CJ said. Bobby's eyes were wet and his face was still pale, but he seemed prepared enough to manage the pain. CJ softly tightened several strips of fabric around his brother's forearms. As the pressure grew snug, Bobby did his best not to cry. Kip watched on, hoping not to see his big brother wince. Each time Bobby showed weakness, it was like a dagger in his heart. The visuals made him even more nervous than before. Up until that day, Kip hadn't seen Bobby cry. Despite CJ being championed to lead them forward, seeing his eldest brother so vulnerable hurt. Sadie remained brimming with trauma. She barely had her bearings enough to keep little Donnie by her side, but occupying her mind with keeping him safe had distracted her just enough to remain operable. Isaac felt the same horrible sensations as his sister, but had no distraction to lean on. The flashes of Sam's pulpy head and gushing body haunted him. Isaac put his arm around Sadie. "I love you. Don't worry. I'm gonna protect you," Isaac whispered. He was lying through his teeth. Things would never be all right with Sam gone. Furthermore, the path that lay ahead of them oozed with danger. The words he chose were the type a good big brother spoke to his little sister in time of doubt. Isaac didn't even have to think about it. It just happened. He put aside their petty grievances, and the next few moments might very well be the life-defining. Here, another one. Ow. Dang it, Tanya yelled. "What's wrong?" Isaac muttered. "Freaking ants. Must have missed one." Tanya scratched her irritated ankles. The raspberry rise upon her skin gave way to an itch with no end. The dotted red blotches peppering her legs, her semi-sharp nails clawed against the corrupted flesh, drawing a little blood and causing a modest amount of translucent liquid to leak. Tanya pushed through the pain and returned to her prior effort, another sign with her insights that was eerily similar to the ones she'd seen before going down the slide. It read, "Playground rules." CJ turned to the commotion and saw Tanya examining the sign. He finished binding the final measure of cloth around Bobby's arm, then turned his attention to his sister. There was an added interest in the words, since he now knew the understanding the riddles could potentially be the difference between life and death. "What's it say?" he asked. "Forget throwing stones, just make it across. But losing this game is the ultimate loss. What lies ahead is a horrible drop. Once you've got to move past, see Mom and Pop. First things first, go for a hop. Take a wrong step and become the slop. You have no choice. You must play the game and learn that heaven and hell are one and the same." The fuck does that even mean? "What do you want?" Bobby screamed. He looked up towards the ceiling as if someone might somehow answer him. "Hey, be cool," CJ said. "Cool? How can you be fucking cool? Right now?" "You know what I mean. Screaming isn't going to change stuff. We gotta work together." Tanya looked back at the massive meat grinders and noticed something she hadn't before. At the end of the hopscotch outline in front of each meat grinder, there was 2 clear tubes that ran upwards. The squared sprouts at the end of each were angled in the direction of the hopscotch path. From the darkness below, she couldn't determine exactly where the tubes led. "What are we going to do now?" Sadie cried. The general tension and arguments within the group had her anxiety to a pinnacle. CJ stared down at the line of the area that needed to reach. He certainly would feel like he'd reached heaven if he made it through, at least for a moment anyhow. He spun his head towards his brother, Kip, then Bobby, before finally looking eyes with Isaac. The seriousness of his glare spoke volumes. Telepathically, he transferred a message that screamed, "Get ready. We're gonna play hopscotch, I guess." Licking the wounds. "We've got to talk to them at some point," Molly whispered, her fingers softly tracing out the white button attached to the side of her steel collar. "Not yet," Tom whispered back. Tom kept a close eye on Rock. He needed to ensure they didn't attract his attention. From his vantage point, the big man seemed to be living in his own head anyhow. The fresh blood still trickling down his cheek, at the flare of madness that wavered in his eye told him that much. Tom used his shaking hand to put his wife's fingers away from the button and squeeze it tight. We've got 2 chances to talk. We can't use one just for the sake of talking to them. It's too important. I can't watch my babies die again, Molly cried. Her entire face still leaked. The drool, tears, and snot splurged into a trifecta of visible torment. Shh, Tom begged. He was doing his best to keep Molly quiet while juggling the task of keeping his own emotions in check. I know you don't, honey, but there's nothing we can tell them that's going to change how they approach this. Just like with... This time, Tom had to cut himself off. His emotions clogged his ability to articulate the makeshift plan. Just like with Sam, he finally managed. A quiver ripped through Tom's body as he attempted to regain his composure. He was trying to think as strategically as possible for his family. Tom's eyes bounced back from the screen containing the cluster of children. They landed on the fiendish hopscotch path, then back into his unraveling wife. His nerves were through the roof. Any second, another child might have their final moments pass on the screen. The thought felt selfish, but he couldn't be overly concerned about anything. He needed to solidify the means to an end, the madness they'd been ensnared in, and whisk those who remained to safety. Tom zeroed in and turned off as much of the distracting sadness inside as possible. If we're going to help them, we need to be able to offer them something besides comfort. We don't know how any of this shit works, he explained, pointing toward the meat grinders in the tube. We need information that's useful. It'd be so much easier if they just accept it, Greg interjected. A harsh cackle escaped Greg's lips. Forget about him, Tom whispered. Forget about the Matthews? Highly unlikely. We leave our mark. Me, baby doll, and all our young ones. I'll be standing at the top of the mountains when it is all said and done. You watch, just you watch, Greg promised. Greg gritted his teeth and squished his grip even tighter on his dead wife's hand. Sir, Tom said. Rock stared ahead at the screen mindlessly. Tom's words had yet to find him. Why are you doing this? Why do all of our children have to die? He asked. Rock tilted his head slightly towards Tom and Molly. They're just kids. Their lives haven't even begun yet. It doesn't seem fair to have them play a game that they don't even know how to. Playground rules are listed on the signs, Rock said. He pointed to the screen at Tanya. She appeared to be reading some of the lettering to the rest of the group. Tom thought about his daughter, Sam, getting crushed by the ceiling just a short time prior. Her cranium exploding, her arms separating from her body, her corpse being juiced like a blood orange. The painful image of Sadie clinging to the dead extremity caused him to cringe. It took everything for Tom to keep his composure, but in his fiery state he couldn't help but let an F-bomb slip. Then why didn't my daughter know she'd be crushed by a fucking ceiling? Rock pondered the question a moment. He looked at the young boy on the screen, as Donnie's flat-lined features clung to his expression without fail. Rock clenched the bloody leash in his pocket again. Not everything's on the signs. Do you think that's fair? Or do you think these kids should all have fair shake at making through the playground? Rock remained mum, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. The logical notion that Tom laid out. Please, if there's anything that you could tell us that might help, even if it's something small. Oh, woe is me. I raised a bunch of pussies, so I need advantage. Is that what I'm hearing? Greg asked. Tom looked back to Molly. Just don't listen to him, he whispered. Well, guess what? The Matthews don't. My boys help. Even Tanya can take care of things on her own. Bandage or not, you ain't got a prayer in the world, Greg continued. Shut up, you sick son of a bitch, Molly screamed. It's okay. I'd be upset if that little dandelion slur was my last hope. Greg grinned again. He enjoyed reminding them of the nickname he'd branded Isaac with. Venom and disgust saturated Molly. She'd found a way to grit her teeth with Tom. They were actually making progress. The wheels were turning with Rock. But Greg was dead set on throwing a monkey wrench into things. Don't play into it, Tom said. Tom applied his own advice to returned to his conversation with Rock. Why are you bleeding? Tom asked. It was clear as day the still fresh scribble of crimson slid lethargically down Rock's chin. Rock didn't respond audibly, but Tom could tell the nuances with his body language had registered the query. He watched the gruff man thoroughly while he tightened his jaw and extended his hand upward. There was symbolism to behold. The question had triggered Rock to wipe the blood away. You don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does. Not you, not us, not our children. Not even Greg, Tom explained. The latter part of his statement caused him to wince, but Tom still meant every word. I don't need a whiny cunt like you telling me what I need. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to watch the show, Greg replied. The smile he brandished while watching his son CJ step up toward the hopscotch squares was nothing short of psychopathic. That a boy, Greg whispered to himself. Tom ignored Greg, continuing his attempt to break through to Rock. You don't have to keep taking her abuse and licking your wounds in the shadows. Following her lead is a choice. You don't have to be like her. When the last words hit Rock, they left a fire inside of him. The hand in his jacket that still clenched the bloody leash suddenly flew from his pocket. His mammoth fist blasted through the drywall, leaving a sizable hole. The comparison enraged him. "Shut your goddamn mouth. I'm not like her, you hear me?" Rock screamed. Tom's eyes studied the ruby-soaked leash hanging from Rock's grasp. Fear flooded into his chest and confusion clouded his mind. His vision toggled from the big man into an unhinged state over to the screen with his children, who stood close to the edge of the platform. The tension had reached a new high. Tom nodded submissively while Molly remained mum. Even Greg seemed to pipe down accordingly. "I'm not like her," Rock whispered to himself. "No, you're not." Savor the insanity. Geraldine set the empty bottle down beside her and let out a cackle. She turned to Fux, who acted as a mirror, also projecting an evil grin of excitement. Their expressions clarified that things were going exactly as planned. "Shall I do it now, Zen?" Fux asked. "Are you mad?" Geraldine asked. Fux had just let his smile rest, but now his sharp teeth had once again found daylight. The facial gesture that German presented her with screamed, "I very well might be." His oddball nature made Geraldine chuckle again. They mirrored each other. Geraldine felt even tipsier than before. She wasn't filled with her normal angry drunkenness. Things were going so well. The mayhem unfolding before her eyes was masterful. Even the sting of Rock's idiocy had faded for a moment. She was so enthralled at the thought of what might come next. However, Fux seemed a little too eager, like a pervert that had just slipped inside a whorehouse. He was ready to blow his load immediately. Even though they both chased the high, Geraldine reminded herself the event they were witnessing wasn't ever going to become a common occurrence. She would not allow her investment to be foolishly squandered. They needed to take their time. They needed to savor every second the disturbing trauma offered. Despite her drunkenness, she studied the dread on the children's face. She had it on video, but she wouldn't do her best to firmly grasp the organic memory. We want them to get as far as possible, maybe even all the way. Killing them all now, well, she hiccuped. What fun would that be? Geraldine couldn't take her eyes off Tanya. Amid all the excitement, she hadn't given much thought to which girl might take after her enough to potentially become her protege. It was quite possible the answer was none. She wasn't aiming to get her hopes up, just to have them dashed. The fact that one of the girls had already perished didn't help her odds any either. But as Tanya stood in front of the sign displayed the playground rules, she felt there was hope. "Understood, my lady. They have so much to see, so much experience," Fux said, concurring with one more methodical approach. As do we, Geraldine replied. She meant the statement in more than one way. There was a lot more slaughter to absorb, but also a lot more to learn about Tanya. The girl's intelligence was certainly on par with her own. Mental aptitude was the most imperishable attribute she desired. Geraldine could see it clearly. While CJ might have appeared to be the leader, every time the children plotted, the attention turned to Tanya. She was the one pulling the strings and strategizing. Tanya's strength couldn't be overlooked either. Sure, she had fallen to pieces a few times, but who hadn't? The most important thing was that she'd found a way to churn through each horrific situation and remained level-headed. In Geraldine's eyes, it was undeniable. She was a natural-born leader. If the girl had an Achilles heel, it was most definitely her soft, kind-hearted nature. Tanya was as sweet as pie and never held a grudge. "We can fix that," Geraldine whispered. "Fix what, my lady?" Fux asked. "Oh, nothing," she replied. Geraldine knew for certain Tanya's tender approach wouldn't be difficult to break. If she'd been able to impose her with Rock, the girl would be no different. And if Rock became more useful than he already was, Tanya might even be able to serve as his eventual replacement. While the girl may have found the courage to overcome the physical obstacles in front of her, Geraldine knew the emotional roadblock she had in mind would surely break Tanya's resolve. Geraldine felt an immense attraction to Tanya's spirit, swelling inside her bosom. She would now watch the screen differently than she had before. She had a new stake in the events they were set to transpire, and as likely as it seemed, Geraldine truly found herself rooting for Tanya. So I was right about that. Meat and bones. "Are you fucking crazy? We can't cross that thing," Bobby cried, adjusting his newly affixed bandages. CJ looked at the humming grinders that held back his brother from the edge of the platform. The last time we didn't follow the rules, CJ hesitated, glancing over at Isaac and Sadie. "Someone died. Well, if she wasn't dumb enough to run down a dark hallway by herself, maybe she'd still be alive." "Don't talk about my sister," Isaac yelled. "What are you going to do about it, you little dandelion dipshit?" Bobby barked. He remained a parrot of his father's persona. "Hey, just stop. We're moving ahead with or without you. Stay here if you want, but I'm going to go get to the end of this thing. I'm getting out of here," CJ said. "Fucking traitor," Bobby muttered. CJ ignored his words, looking away from Bobby and Kip, and away towards Sadie, Isaac, Tanya, and little Donnie. "Does everyone know how to play hopscotch?" They all nodded except for Donnie, who looked as lost as always. "Does everyone think they can make it across?" "I think so," Sadie replied. She was frightened, but CJ's courage gave her strength. Tanya nodded. She took a deep breath, preparing herself mentally, but she was firm in her confidence. "I'm not the best at hopscotch, but I'm not the worst either." "What about him?" Isaac asked. His index finger was pointed at Donnie, who was yet to break his silence. Without warning, Donnie broke away from Sadie. He zipped past the entire group, heading directly for the hopscotch path. "Wait!" CJ yelled, but young Donnie didn't listen. He immediately stuck out one foot, and in a fearless blur sent a chain of multiple hops in motion. The others all collectively held their breath, watching him jump past the gargantuan meat grinders as he made his way to the opposite end of the path. But Donnie didn't stop there. CJ watched it all as the boy's fate landed on the platform titled Heaven. But when Donnie did next was the last thing he was hoping to see. Continuing to hop in place, Donnie turned his body around, as would expected of a player in a traditional game of hopscotch, but this was the furthest thing from a traditional game. As the boy headed back towards his point of origin, CJ released a horrific gasp and used him with the rest of the children. "No!" CJ cried. His natural response was the most dangerous. CJ promptly sprang into action. CJ would have crossed the path himself regardless. He hoped as he hopped closer towards Heaven, his presence would be enough to force Donnie to turn back. Donnie didn't flinch. He continued on his path, his foot dropping quickly into the 9 square. The pressure and danger of the situation increased as CJ accelerated his pace. He aimed to beat Donnie to the midpoint of the bridge where he could set both of his heels to the ground in unison. The star athlete's God-given assets brought him to 4 and 5 square before Donnie, luckily. As Donnie entered the 6 square, CJ planted both his feet firmly in the single swoop. He scooped Donnie up in his arms and carried on the other direction without hesitation. His footing and balance were flawless as CJ propelled them past the final hazards. They both fell forward to safety, landing on top of the depictions of dying angels. The joy of the children felt after the success of CJ's death-defying stunt was quickly overshadowed. A loud clicking noise echoed out from the ceiling above what they stood. As the ticks increased in both their pitch and pace, Isaac looked up above them. The same fate that he'd failed at stopping his sister from suffering was suddenly staring back at him again. For the first time as he watched the large slab of stone closing in, he felt guilt. However, he didn't have enough time to simmer on Sam's final moments, or his body would end up juiced by the identical method. "Go now," Isaac commanded, looking at Sadie. The little girl found her gusto. She didn't cry or argue, knowing the clock was ticking. Sadie's blonde pigtails bobbed along as she methodically skipped her way towards Heaven. Tanya and Isaac both looked at each other. "Ladies first," Isaac said. As Kip watched Tanya take her hops, he glanced over at his big brother. The fright in his eyes was dominant. We gotta go now, right?" Kip asked. "Duh," Bobby yelped. Isaac watched, holding his breath as Tanya made her way across without fail. The ceiling was now coming down even faster. The threat of descending death was a mega dose of motivation for everyone to move fast. Isaac rushed up to the edge of the chalk outline, struggling to set his worries aside. Kip and Bobby hustled, lining up behind him. As Isaac committed the first of his few stops, the steel bombs of the mooing cages above came loose. The parting screeches of agony the animals unleashed caused Isaac to nearly lose his foothold. He teetered to the left, trying to keep it stable. He peered down into the blaze of chaos. The rapid spiraling of malicious metal tore into the cow's overfed frames, breaking the wailing animals down before his eyes. As the cow became further entangled, the sickening snap of limbs mixed with the sound of metal dividing the meat was unignorable. An ultraviolet stew of sinew, beef, fur, and blood painted the chrome. Regaining his balance, Isaac ripped his eyes away from the destruction and pushed forward. "Hurry up," Kip cried, nipping at Isaac's heel. Bobby watched the ceiling drop closer and closer as he waited anxiously for both Isaac and his brother to progress. He didn't have much time left. Bobby had more grace to his step than one might assume. His obsession with skateboarding offered him enough practice to believe in himself. However, he would have preferred that the lane be clear when he took his shot. As he watched on, the luxury appeared to be questionable at best. The boys were oblivious to the pulverizing porridge that had suddenly occupied the clear tubes erecting in the front of the Heaven space. The spouts at the end of them dribbled with hunks of gore and juices down on the crushed cows. The gushing gunk finally caught Isaac's eye. As he took another hop forward, the sickening steam grew thicker. What was about to transpire had finally become obvious. With only a split second to react, Isaac did his best to gauge the projection of the slaughterhouse slop. He paused momentarily, hunching his shoulders to prepare himself. He vaulted forward past the final square, propelling himself to Heaven. Just before the wave of garbled, drizzling violence reached him. "Ah!" Kip cried. The hunks of terror splattered all over his face, eyes, and entire body. Kip tumbled toward a gruesome demise. He toppled over head first, and the sharp, blood-drenched blades minced through his upper body with ease. The familiar sound of bones breaking, the meat being mauled, found the airwaves again. The machine tore through Kip's tender tissues like Kleenex at a funeral parlor. "Kip," Bobby wailed. Sadie looked back to sickness, the likes of which he'd never known, growing inside the pit of his stomach. Tanya and Sadie were equally distraught, releasing high-pitched screams that were so intense they sounded demonic. Donnie was just there. Bobby mustered all of his strength to keep himself from fainting. Forced to consume the short-lived cries of his kid brother, he watched as the warm fluid erupted from the pile of slop that no longer resembled Kip's body. Amid the flood of fluid and gore-caked elements, pieces of Kip peeked out within the mess. Patches of mashed cranium and hair were scattered about. Droopy eyeballs, separated from each other, divided at such a distance that the possibility of survival was no longer an option. Bobby remained slack-jawed as the ceiling dropped lower and lower. The initial shock waned in his system. He knew it wouldn't be long until another meaty regurgitation was set to commence. As the cold stone closed in, just inches from his skull, Bobby had no choice but to step out into the first square. He secured both feet and paused. I'm gonna keep, so there was an image of, Kip in the process of being, like, ripped apart. I am on page 200, but I'm gonna finish out until the end of this chapter, which is only, like, 4 more pages. Yeah. The glimmering instruments of horror were in his head. With his eyes steadily fixed on the sharp edges, he watched them slice and dice Kip's already divided sections. As the portions manipulated repeatedly, Bobby dug his fingernails into his palms. The sound of his favorite sibling, shredded meat, being sucked into the industrial-grade modified meat grinder filled his ears. He noticed one of the gunky tubes at the end of his path filling up to capacity again. As the bloody pieces of his brother dribbled out of the sprouts, Bobby had a decision to make. The cow blood and the pink chunks that littered the hopscotch outline made the entire surface slick. The condition effectively eliminated the option of running to avoid Kip's regurgitated remains. He would have to withstand it. Bobby froze in place and squatted, still being serenaded by the cries of the other children. He lowered his shoulder and prepared himself. As the glistening mixture launched out, the idea that he'd just had a conversation with the macabre monkey shot-headed his way entered his mind. The vomit mixture engulfed him, but he remained sturdy. The splatter covered his hair, face, and the entire front of his body. The smell of fresh death crept up his nostrils while chunks of his siblings slid off him in every direction. It was like he'd just taken a long shower in Satan's bathroom. Bobby was screaming but maintained his balance in the face of flurry. He wiped Kip's ground remnants away from his eyes first. The flow ahead had gone dry, but a hazardous trek still remained. With pieces of Kip now added to the already slippery track, his venture would soon be the most volatile of all the children. "Bobby, be careful," CJ said. CJ's words were barely audible. He had been shaken by Kip's grisly demise. His mouth curled up from his bottom jaw shattered. The last thing he wanted to see was both of his brothers taken from him in the same breath. Bobby inhaled deeply, trying to concentrate on getting through as safely as possible. He carefully roped his way past the first 3 squares, opting not to jump, relying on his balance instead of momentum. But his next step would be far more difficult. Bobby looked at the pair of double squares that came next. They had accumulated the thickest portion of the bodily slop by the landslide. The mini mountain of gore left a sensation of intimidation running rampant inside him. Bobby kicked away as much of the ground flesh as he could, but his fears manifested when he planted his foot on the clear surface. Overlooking a pinkish wad camouflaged by the carnage, as Bobby set his heel, his legs slid apart. Reacting quickly, he replanted his soul and avoided slipping into a full split. The children let out a collective gasp before finding relief when Bobby's the balance word, threshold word. "There's only a few left," CJ said. CJ was more distraught than he'd ever been, found a way to offer his brother words of encouragement. Bobby repositioned himself and drove forward. Despite his clumsy approach, he was able to set his feet on clearer spots within the last series of spaces before stumbling across the finishing line. When Bobby pulled himself off from the ground, he was panting hard and teary-eyed. CJ moved in to hug him, but Bobby shrugged his only remaining brother off. He had other ideas in mind. Bobby cocked his meaty fist back and rushed Isaac. Pieces of his brother were still dangling from his hand as he slung it forward. The onslaught shocked all the children. When the heavy blow connected with Isaac's nose, it might as well have been a sucker punch. With no inkling that he should brace himself for a fight, his lanky frame collapsed backwards onto the floor. Blood and snot rushed out of his face, painting his lips and chin. "Bobby," Tanya cried. "What are you doing?" CJ screamed. "Leave him alone," Sadie demanded. The little girl began swinging wildly. Her hands collided several times with Bobby's big gut. Teresa saw it wasn't much of a threat, but it was more about the principle of her actions than the actual assault. The conflict resembled a fly pestering a bull. Sadie's weak blows bounced off Bobby's blubber, only serving to agitate him. Bobby stiffened his fingers and took aim at her. The backhand sent the little girl reeling until she landed butt first on the ground beside her. Isaac. "Bobby, stop," CJ barked. He dangled his arms around Bobby, attempting to stun any further violence. "Get the fuck off me. You want to be on their side? I'll put you down too," Bobby yelled. "They didn't do anything," Tanya interjected. "Shut up. They don't care about you. Kip's fucking gone now because of them." "That's not true," Sadie exclaimed. Bobby pointed his bloody finger at Isaac. He just went too slow to get Kip. He went just slow enough to get Kip knocked off. He could have gone faster, but he didn't. He didn't want either of us to make it across. Maybe he would have just crossed when the rest of us wanted to instead of arguing Kip might still be here," Tanya yelled. She regretted her words immediately. The hurt in Bobby's eyes somehow compounded in his own mind. He didn't believe it, but that didn't make it any easier to accept, especially coming from his own sister. "Stop fighting," CJ yelled. He threw his hands by his side and squeaked back up with Bobby. Their glossy glares entangled together with an uncomfortable intensity. "Do you want to get out of here?" CJ asked. CJ did his best to keep as cool as possible, but the situation was beyond explosive. Bobby stared down with the seething wrinkles of disgust frying like an egg in a pan on his pupils. They drudged up and condensed all of the discomfort he felt. Well, do you? The question wasn't easy enough to ask, but under the circumstances it still remained confirmation. Bobby's head remained in a state of lockjaw. His teeth dug into the side of his mouth as he nodded. Then we need to move. We don't even know how much time we have until the next wall collapses or ceilings tries to crush us, CJ explained. So that's it? We're just gonna forget about Kip, I guess? Bobby asked. The watery look. I really am just thinking about, like, what would happen if this was me and my brother in this situation. I would not do well. Oh, God. The watery look resurrected on CJ's face. I never said that. Then say it. Admit what that slur did, Bobby yelled again, gesturing towards Isaac. I love Kip just as much as you, but I don't want to see anyone else get hurt. The only way we're getting out of this is together. Don't you get it? A crooked smile crept up on Bobby's face. He took a few steps away from CJ. Oh, I get it. I see who you are, Bobby whispered. CJ didn't know what else to say to him. He found a small victory in Bobby's overall demeanor, seemingly slightly calmer, but the situation remained complicated. The end of their exchange didn't make him feel like Bobby was on the same page as he was. A clock remained ticking in his head as CJ internally acknowledged that time wasn't on their side. Spending time translating his words into something Bobby might get behind was a poor allocation of his effort. CJ severed the interaction with his brother and panned back towards the other kids. We gotta get going, CJ said. Oh my God, I'm really just thinking about my own brother. As his gaze landed on the group, he couldn't help but notice that it looked smaller than before. Kip was obviously absent now, but even so, it seemed like there was still someone missing. Wait. Where's that kid? CJ asked. He quickly started to scan his surroundings, eventually falling on the only direction that he hadn't looked yet. Directly behind him, his eyes found the 4 deep red letters that lingered ominously over the doorway. The sign read, Hell. Inside the opening, little Donnie was already making his next move, the crimson glow bleeding out from the crack, covered Donnie's tiny body as he slipped and slid. Okay, that's page 206. I didn't think this would actually, make me, sad, make me emotional. Because everyone just talks about how, gross it is and how, disturbing it is. No one talks about, oh, shit. Fuck Disney Princess. Oh, my God. I'm gonna yell at her so much. Oh, I know for a fact. She's an older sibling. I know for a fact they had to have had feelings like this. Because what the... Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I think Kip has Golden Chainsaw for most impactful kill. I don't think there could be a dull machete for this. There's still a lot more kids who can die. But I don't... So far, out of the 4 deaths we've had, each one has been within 50-minute increments. Other than the first one, which is we get, or the second part, 50 to 100, we get 2 for the price of 1. But the one happens so close after that first 50 page where it's they're pretty spaced out. Alright. I don't want to say hope you enjoyed it. I also don't want to say hope you're in the same state as I hope the rest of your morning, evening, night goes well. I'm having some regrets. You guys remember that? The no regrets? It was don't have any regrets. I forget what the commercial was actually for, but it was a tattoo. I think it was Snickers. And it was just regrets. Sorry. And then the girl takes a bite of a Snickers, and this heavily tattooed man is oh, and then takes the Snicker. Yep. All right. Well, toodaloo. Bye-bye.